Girls, today I'm going to tell you a story that will shock you. I found out my neighbor was cheating on his wife, and the worst part is, I saw it all happening right in front of me. Don't look away because what I discovered about this betrayal will shock you. Look, every day here on the channel I bring you a new story or gossip that I see behind the scenes in my neighborhood. And you know how observant I am, right? Well, this time, I witnessed something that really left me outraged. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel to be notified every time I post a new gossip story, and leave a comment below. And don't leave the video, okay? Because the ending of this story is truly surprising, I guarantee it. But before we begin today's story, I always like to give you a special message. I pinned some wonderful natural products in the first comment that can greatly benefit your health. These are products I use and wholeheartedly recommend. There are options for a variety of problems: insomnia, joint pain, diabetes, diet products, you name it. Just click the link pinned in the comments to take a look. Besides helping you, you're also helping our channel. Now let's get to the point. Let me tell you about this absurd situation I discovered here in the neighborhood. I've lived in this house for over 15 years, and I know practically every neighbor here. There's a couple who lives in the blue house across the street, Michael and Linda. They've always been considered the perfect couple on the street, you know? The ones everyone looks at and thinks, wow, what a beautiful relationship. Michael must be in his early 40s, a handsome man, always very well dressed when he goes to work. He wears elegant suits, his hair is always neat, and he has a charming way of walking. Linda is also a beautiful woman, must be about 38, always very well groomed, her hair always in place, her nails manicured, her clothes impeccable. They have that magazine look, you know? They got married about 8 years ago, and I remember the reception perfectly. It was a small but elegant ceremony. They looked so in love. Whenever I saw them together, they were holding hands, talking, laughing. They truly were a couple whose harmony was remarkable. Linda works at a marketing firm and always leaves home around 8 a.m. She has a very regular routine. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday she goes to the office, and Tuesday and Thursday she works in the field, visiting clients. Michael works from home. He's a consultant in some financial field. I've never quite figured it out, but I know he spends most of his time at home. In the early years of their marriage, they were that clingy couple, you know? Always together on weekends, hand in hand shopping, gardening together. She planted some beautiful rose bushes in the front of the house, and he always helped her water them. It was a sweet sight to behold. But about 6 months ago, I started noticing strange activity around their house. And you know how I am, right? I can't let anything go unnoticed. It was a Tuesday. I remember it well because I was watering my plants on the porch when I saw a strange car pull up in front of their house. It was a small car, one of those popular cars, quite simple compared to the cars they have. A young woman, very young, got out of it. She must have been 25 at most. She was beautiful, but with a very different style from Linda. Where Linda is all tidy and classic, this woman had a more casual look. Jeans, sneakers, and loose hair. What caught my attention was the timing. Linda had recently left for work, and this woman arrived as if she knew exactly that her wife wasn't home. Coincidence? I don't think so. The girl rang the doorbell, and Michael opened the door with a smile on his face. It wasn't just any smile, ladies. It was the smile of someone happy to see someone. You know, that smile we give when we meet someone special. They greeted each other at the door, and I could see a hug a little longer than would be normal for a work visit or a normal friendship. At that moment, I thought, Ruth, you're seeing things where there aren't any. Because, we can't go around judging people. But something in my instincts, as an experienced woman, told me that there was something wrong there. They entered the house and I stood on my porch, trying to hide my observation. I continued watering the plants but kept an eye on their house. The woman was there for almost 3 hours. 3 hours, people. What kind of guest stays for 3 hours in a married man's house when his wife isn't there? When she left, I noticed their behavior. They stood talking at the door for a few minutes, and the woman seemed a little emotional. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but his body language was that of someone comforting someone. He even placed his hand on her shoulder in a very affectionate gesture. And you think it was just a one-time occurrence? No way. The following Thursday, there she was again. Same time, same routine. Linda leaves for work and shortly afterward the girl shows up. This time I was more attentive and I saw that she didn't ring the doorbell. Michael was waiting for her at the window and opened the door before she even got there. This, for me, was confirmation that they had a date. Nobody waits at the window for a casual visitor, right? And once again, she stayed there for hours. This time, almost 4 hours. I started to get really intrigued by this situation. During the day, I kept thinking, what the hell are they doing in there for so long? And my mind, which you know how it is, started to imagine several possibilities, and none of them were good for poor Linda. The following week, I strategically positioned myself in my living room, which has a window that gives a perfect view of their living room. And that's when I started seeing scenes that truly shocked me. Through the window of their living room, I could see them talking on the couch. They stood very close. Sometimes she leaned toward him. Sometimes he held her hand. At one point, I saw him put his arm around her shoulders, a gesture that was clearly not just friendly. Guys, I was outraged. How could a man do this to his own wife? Linda is a wonderful woman, always polite to me, always friendly. And there he was, literally having this other woman over her head. What bothered me most was how casual everything was. It didn't seem like they were hiding much. Of course, he only saw her when Linda wasn't around. But they didn't completely close the curtains. They didn't seem afraid of being discovered. This made me think that maybe this cheating had been going on for a long time, and they were so used to it that they didn't even bother hiding it properly anymore. Or worse, maybe they wanted someone to find out. Have you ever heard of people cheating precisely because they want the relationship to end? During those first few weeks of observation, I tried to understand their routine. The girl always arrived on Tuesdays and Thursdays, always between 9 and 9:30 in the morning, always staying until early afternoon, never on weekends, never when Linda was home. And Michael's behavior with Linda also started to catch my attention. Before, when I saw them together in the garden or leaving the house, they seemed like a loving couple. But lately, I noticed they barely spoke when they were together. He seemed distant. She seemed sad. I once saw Linda coming home from work early, and she stood in the garden for a few minutes, looking at the rose bushes she had planted herself. There was something melancholy about the scene, as if she knew something was wrong, but couldn't quite put her finger on it. Did she suspect something? Had she already noticed signs that her husband was being unfaithful? Because you know how it is, girls. We women have a very keen intuition for these things. We always know when something isn't right, even if we don't have concrete proof. I kept wondering if Linda had noticed a different scent on his clothes, if he was acting strangely, if his phone was more guarded than usual. These are classic signs of cheating, and I'm sure a smart woman like Linda wouldn't let them go unnoticed. But what intrigued me most was the other woman's profile. She was quite different from what I'd expect from a lover of a man like Michael. Not that I'm an expert on the subject, but men who cheat usually look for women who are similar to their wives, or completely opposite. This girl had a very youthful, college-age style, always dressed in jeans, sneakers and simple t-shirts. No over-the-top makeup, no provocative clothing. She looked more like a college girl than a femme fatale, capable of breaking up a marriage. And there was something about her manner that caught my attention. She didn't have the confident bearing of a woman who knows she's winning over a married man. On the contrary, sometimes she seemed insecure, nervous. I'd see her walking from the house to the car with her shoulders slightly hunched, as if carrying some emotional weight. This made me wonder if perhaps she didn't know he was married. Had Michael lied to her? Did she believe he was single or divorced? Because look, I've seen plenty of married men lie about their marital status to win over younger women. But then I remembered that she came specifically at times when Linda wasn't there, and that didn't seem like a coincidence. Someone had explained to her what Linda's routine was, and the only person who would know those details was Michael himself. As the weeks went by, I began to feel like a private detective. I wrote down the schedules, observed the details, tried to understand the dynamics between them, and I can assure you that this story was only just beginning, because what I discovered next was even more shocking than I imagined. But I won't spoil anything for now, because in a minute you'll understand how this whole situation got even more complicated. And believe me, what I saw next was enough to leave any of you speechless. One thing I started noticing is that every time the girl left, Michael would stand at the window watching her car drive away. And it wasn't just any look, ladies. It was a look of longing, you know, like he didn't want her to leave. And after she left, he always looked a little different for the rest of the day. I'd see him in the garden, but he seemed distant, pensive. Sometimes he'd just stand there staring into space, as if reliving the moments he'd spent with her. When Linda came home from work, they barely greeted each other. She'd go inside, and he'd stay in the garden, or go inside too, but without the same excitement as a couple they'd had before. It was as if he were living two completely different lives, one with his wife, and one with this mysterious woman. And you know what caught my attention the most? Linda seemed to be trying to win back her husband's attention. I'd see her coming home with shopping bags, sometimes with flowers, as if she were trying to create romantic moments. Poor thing. She probably sensed something was wrong, but couldn't quite put her finger on it. I once saw her trying to talk to him in the garden, and he seemed impatient, as if he wanted the conversation to end quickly. My heart ached for Linda in that moment. It's terrible to see a woman trying so hard to save a relationship, while her husband's heart is elsewhere. Girls, I swear it was getting harder and harder to keep this secret. Several times I thought about giving Linda a hint, saying something indirect to make her more aware. But at the same time, I kept thinking, Ruth, are you sure about what you're seeing? What if you're wrong? Because, look, making an accusation like that is no joke. It's something that can destroy a family, a marriage. But on the other hand, if I were right, Linda had a right to know what was going on. Right? This ethical question consumed me. I spent nights thinking, what would I do if it were me? Would I want someone to tell me? And the answer was always yes. I wanted to know, even if it hurt. That's when I decided to step up my observation. I needed to be absolutely certain before taking any action. And that's when things got even more interesting, because what I discovered in the following weeks completely changed my perspective on the whole situation. But that's a topic for the next part of our conversation, because you won't believe what I witnessed next. The situation took a turn I never imagined, and what seemed like a simple betrayal turned into something much more complex. Don't look away, girls, because what I discovered will surprise you so much. And you know, I always tell you everything in great detail. So get ready, because there are a lot of shocking things coming. Returning to our story, after a few weeks of observing this situation, I began to notice even more specific patterns in their behavior. The girl didn't just arrive on Tuesdays and Thursdays, as I had initially thought. Sometimes she would show up on Fridays as well, always when Linda was away. And the most interesting thing is that she never arrived empty-handed. She always carried a purse, sometimes a bag, as if she were taking something to him or bringing something back. This made me think that perhaps they had some kind of business together, something beyond their romantic relationship. Were they planning to run away together? Was she helping him hide money from Linda? Or worse yet, were they plotting something against Linda? My experienced woman's mind began to create 1,000 theories. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen making tea when I heard voices coming from the neighbor's backyard. It was a low conversation, but since their backyard is very close to mine, I could hear a few stray words. I couldn't make out everything, but I heard the woman saying something about not being able to take it anymore. And when are you going to tell her? This made me even more intrigued. Tell who what? Linda? Were they planning to reveal their relationship? Or was she pressuring him to break up? The tone of the conversation didn't seem romantic. It seemed more tense, as if they were discussing something important. Sometimes her voice would get louder, a little emotional, and I could hear him trying to calm her down. That night, I could barely sleep thinking about what I'd heard. The next day, I spent the entire day waiting to see if she'd show up again. And she did. This time, she stayed even longer, almost 5 hours. When she left that day, I paid special attention to their emotional state. She looked like she'd been crying. Her eyes were red, and she walked slowly to her car, as if she didn't want to leave. He stood at the door watching her until she got in the car and drove away. And then, for the rest of the afternoon, Michael was visibly shaken. I saw him walking around the yard as if nervous, sometimes stopping and running his hand through his hair, a typical gesture of someone stressed or worried. When Linda arrived that day, the situation became even more tense. I saw them talking in the garden, and from their body language, it seemed like she was asking questions and he was giving evasive answers. At one point, she crossed her arms and stared at him, with an expression I interpreted as distrust. Was she starting to get suspicious? Had she noticed a change in his behavior? Or perhaps a less discreet neighbor than me had already tipped her off? That night, I noticed the lights in their house stayed on until very late, and at times I could hear raised voices. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but the tone suggested an argument. This made me even more concerned about the situation. The following week, something happened that completely changed my perception of the whole story. The woman arrived on Tuesday as usual, but this time I noticed some details that had gone unnoticed before. When she got out of the car, I noticed she had a slight limp on one leg, and when she approached the front door, I saw Michael greet her with an expression of genuine concern, as if he were genuinely concerned for her well-being. They spoke briefly at the door before going in, and I could see that he was holding her arm, not in a romantic way, but in a protective way, as if he were helping her walk. This made me wonder if perhaps she was experiencing some health issue, and he was helping in some way. But even so, it didn't explain the secrecy, nor the fact that it only happened when Linda wasn't home. That afternoon, they sat talking in the backyard, and I got a better look at their interaction. There was affection that was undeniable, but it began to feel like a different kind of affection. It wasn't the affection I see between lovers. It was something more familiar. I started noticing physical details that had previously gone unnoticed. The girl had hair the same color as Michael, a very specific dark brown, and when she smiled, I noticed she had a dimple in her chin, very similar to one Michael had. Was I beginning to see similarities where none existed, or was there actually some physical resemblance between them that went beyond coincidence? Girls, I can tell you in advance that this story was taking a turn I never imagined. What seemed like a clear and simple betrayal was turning into something much more complex and mysterious. And you have no idea what I discovered next. But stay tuned, because the most shocking revelation is yet to come. And when I tell you, I'm sure you'll be as surprised as I was. Guys, after everything I'd already seen, I was increasingly convinced I was witnessing a blatant betrayal. But what happened in the following weeks left me even more shocked. And you won't believe the details. I uncovered One Thursday morning, I was organizing my kitchen when I heard a car outside. It was the car arriving, as always, promptly at 9 o'clock. But this time, I paid special attention to every movement, every gesture, every detail. She got out of the car and walked to Michael's door with a different posture. She seemed more determined, as if she'd made some important decision. She was carrying a briefcase, one of those documents, which made me think they might be planning something concrete. Michael opened the door before she even rang the bell, as if he'd been eagerly waiting for her, and the hug they shared at the door was unlike any other I'd ever witnessed. It was a long, tight, emotional embrace. She even rested her head on his shoulder for a few seconds. Girls, I swear my heart raced at that moment. It was the clearest proof of intimacy I'd ever seen between them. There was no longer any doubt in my mind that they were romantically involved. They entered the house, and as usual, I positioned myself in my living room to try to observe through the window. This time, they sat at the kitchen table, which was right in my line of sight. The folder she had brought was opened, and they began to review some papers together. You know what I thought at the time? That they were planning how to divide Michael's assets. Maybe they were looking at bank accounts, properties, investments. Maybe she was a lawyer helping him prepare for divorce. Their conversation seemed very serious. Sometimes she'd point to something on the paper, and he'd nod in agreement. Sometimes I'd see her hold his hand across the table in a gesture of support and affection. After an hour of reviewing the papers, they got up and went to the living room. That's when I witnessed the most compromising scene of all. They sat on the couch, very close to each other, and began a conversation that seemed very intimate. At one point, she started crying. It wasn't a delicate cry, girls. It was the cry of someone who was truly moved, desperate even. Michael comforted her, putting his arm around her, and she snuggled into his chest. They stayed like that for several minutes, him stroking her hair, her crying softly. It was an intimate scene that left no room for doubt about their relationship. After she calmed down, they continued talking, but now with even greater physical proximity. She was practically lying on his lap, and he continued to stroke her hair. Sometimes he kissed her forehead, a gesture that struck me as extremely affectionate and protective. Girls, I was watching the destruction of a marriage unfold right in front of me. Poor Linda, working to support her family, and her husband there, comforting another woman, kissing her forehead, stroking her hair. At that moment, I made a decision. I had to tell Linda what was happening. It didn't matter if she'd be upset with me, or if it would create a scandal in the neighborhood. She had a right to know that her husband was cheating on her in the most blatant way possible. But before taking any action, I wanted more evidence. So, in the following days, I intensified my observations even further, and I can assure you that what I discovered was even more shocking. The following Tuesday, she arrived earlier than usual, around 8:30, and this time, she had a key to the house. That's right, girls. She opened the door with her own key, as if she lived there. That was the final straw for me. What man gives his house key to his mistress? Only someone who's planning to leave his wife and live with someone else. Michael was clearly preparing to leave Linda. That day, I was able to observe even more details of their intimacy. Through the kitchen window, I saw them preparing breakfast together. She knew perfectly where everything was in the kitchen, moving through the cabinets naturally, as if she actually lived there. And what struck me most was how naturally they interacted. It didn't seem like the unbridled passion of an extramarital affair. It seemed more like a couple who had known each other for a long time, who had a genuine intimacy and an established routine. While she worked on the stove, he stood behind her, his hands on her waist, and they spoke quietly. At one point, he kissed her neck, and she turned and kissed him on the mouth. It was a long, passionate kiss, the kind that leaves no doubt about the feelings between two people. Girls, I was witnessing a betrayal in real time, and the worst part is that they seemed so happy, so natural together that it was obvious this relationship had been going on for a long time. It wasn't something recent, it was a solid relationship. After breakfast, they went to the living room and settled on the couch to talk. The conversation seemed serious again, and I noticed she showed him something on her phone. They studied the screen together, and he seemed concerned about what he was seeing. Was she showing messages from Linda? Was Linda suspicious and sending messages questioning her husband's behavior? Or perhaps they were messages from another man interested in her, and she was asking Michael for advice. My imagination started to run wild, because when we witness a situation like this, our mind creates 1,000 possibilities, and every possibility I could imagine was bad for poor Linda. That afternoon, when Linda came home from work, I paid special attention to the interaction between the couple. And girls, it was painful to watch. She arrived with a grocery bag, clearly having stopped on the way to pick up something special for dinner. She walked into the house with a smile on her face, as if she were happy to get home to her husband. But he barely looked at her. He was on the couch fiddling with his phone, his expression distant. She tried to talk to him about his workday, and he responded in monosyllables, never taking his eyes off the phone. Linda was clearly disappointed by her husband's cold reception. She went to the kitchen, probably to make dinner, while he remained on the couch, scrolling through his phone. I'd bet anything he was texting the other woman. During dinner, which I could observe through the kitchen window, they barely spoke. Linda tried to make small talk, talking about work, the neighbors, and weekend plans, but Michael's mind was clearly elsewhere. At one point, his cell phone rang, and he quickly got up to answer it. He left the kitchen, probably going to his bedroom or office to answer it. Linda sat alone at the table, eating in silence, with a look of sadness that broke my heart. When he returned a few minutes later, he had a more cheerful expression, as if the call had lifted his mood. This confirmed to me that it was probably the other woman on the phone. Girls, let me ask you something. What would you do in my shoes? I was watching a woman being betrayed in the most blatant way possible, and at the same time, witnessing her happiness slowly being destroyed. Would you tell me? Leave a comment below with your thoughts on what I should have done. And don't forget to check out those natural products I pinned in the first comment. They're wonderful products that really work. And besides taking care of your health, you're also helping our channel. But getting back to our story, the following week something happened that made me even more angry. It was a Friday, and Linda had told me on Thursday that she was going on a work trip and wouldn't be back until Sunday. It was a last-minute trip, a work-related one. And guess what happened? On Friday morning, right after Linda left for the airport, the other woman arrived. But this time, she didn't just come for a few hours. She arrived with a suitcase. That's right, girls. She brought a suitcase as if she were going to spend the whole weekend there. I was outraged. How can a man have the nerve to bring his mistress to spend the weekend in the house where he lives with his wife? All weekend long, they acted like a normal couple. I'd see them shopping together on Saturday mornings, returning with bags from the supermarket. On Saturday afternoon, they lounged in the backyard, she reading a book while he gardened. It seemed like a completely normal domestic scene, except for the fact that his legitimate wife was away. On Sunday morning, I saw them having breakfast in the backyard, enjoying the sunshine. They looked so relaxed, so happy. It was obvious they'd done this before. It wasn't the first time she'd spent a weekend there when Linda was away. And what revolted me most was that they didn't even bother to hide from the neighbors. They were there, in the backyard, in full view of everyone, as if they were a real couple, as if Linda didn't exist, as if that house were theirs. On Sunday afternoon, around 4 o'clock, she packed her suitcase and got ready to leave. Linda would arrive around 6, so they had enough time for her to leave, and for him to clean up any evidence that another woman was in the house. But what I witnessed as they said goodbye was heartbreaking. They hugged at the door for several minutes, clearly not wanting to be separated. She was crying, and he comforted her, kissing her cheek, whispering something in her ear. When she finally got into the car, he stood at the door waving until she disappeared around the corner. Afterward, he stood there for a few minutes, his expression sad, as if her departure was truly painful for him. Girls, at that moment I understood this wasn't just a fling. They truly loved each other. It was a serious relationship with deep feelings on both sides. Michael was clearly in love with this woman, and she with him. This made the situation even more complicated and painful. A casual betrayal, a fleeting fling, is one thing. A serious romantic relationship running parallel to a marriage is quite another. When Linda arrived home from her trip around 6 o'clock, I was watching from my window to see how the couple would meet. She came into the house excited, probably wanting to tell him about her trip, perhaps with a gift she'd bought for him. But the reception she received was frosty. Michael was watching television and barely got up to greet her. She tried to tell him about her trip and show him some photos on her phone, but he seemed bored and uninterested. At one point, she approached him on the couch, clearly wanting a hug, a cuddle, some way to show him that he'd missed her. But he pulled away, claiming he was tired and had a busy weekend. Linda was visibly hurt by her husband's coldness. She stood in the living room for a few minutes, staring at him, as if she didn't understand what was happening. Then she grabbed her suitcase and went to the bedroom, probably to unpack. That night, I noticed they didn't have dinner together. Linda stayed in the kitchen alone, and Michael stayed in the living room, watching TV. It was as if they were two strangers sharing the same house. And it was that night that I made the final decision. I had to tell Linda what was happening. No matter the consequences, she had a right to know that her marriage was a sham. But before I did anything, I wanted to take one more look to make absolutely sure I wasn't fooling myself. And that's when something happened that completely changed my perspective on the whole situation. The following Tuesday, when the woman arrived for her usual meeting with Michael, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, pretending I was just relaxing in the fresh air. But really, I wanted to hear something of their conversation, and you won't believe what I overheard. It was just a few stray words, but they completely changed the course of my investigation. I heard her calling him Dad. That's right, girls. She said Daddy very clearly. At first, I thought I'd misheard, or that it was an endearment between lovers. But then, paying closer attention, I heard a few more words that completely confused me. She was talking about our conversation, and when are you going to tell her about me? And at one point, I clearly heard her say, Dad, I can't take this secret anymore. Girls, my mind went into overdrive. Had I misread everything from the start? Could this woman not be Michael's lover, but rather his daughter? But that didn't make sense. Michael and Linda had been married for 8 years, and it had never been mentioned that he had children from previous relationships. And why would a daughter be kept secret from his wife? That afternoon, I was completely distraught by this possibility. Had I spent all these months imagining a betrayal that didn't exist? Had my gossipy mind created a story of adultery where there was actually a family story? But then I remembered all the affectionate gestures I'd witnessed, the lingering hugs, the kisses on the forehead, the intimacy between them. How could I explain all of this if she really was his daughter? And most importantly, why would a daughter be kept secret from her wife? What kind of family situation could generate such secrecy? Girls, I can tell you in advance that the truth behind this story is much more complex and exciting than anything I could have imagined. And when I found out what was really happening, I was completely shocked. But you'll find out soon enough, because the final revelation of this story will leave you speechless. I guarantee you'll never guess the truth behind everything I've observed over these months. And you know that I always tell you everything in great detail. So stay tuned, because the end of this story is truly surprising. After hearing that word, Father, I spent days trying to understand what was really going on. I began paying attention to details that had previously gone unnoticed, trying to find clues that would confirm or deny this new theory. One thing that struck me was that Now observing from this new perspective, I could actually see physical similarities between them. Besides the same hair color and the cleft chin I'd already noticed, they had similar gestures, the same way they tilted their heads when they were thoughtful. And there was something about the way he treated her that, I now realized, was more protective than romantic. When she cried, he comforted her like a father would, a struggling daughter. When she was upset, he had infinite patience, like someone who truly cared about her well-being unconditionally. But still, I couldn't understand why a daughter would be kept a secret. What situation could be so complicated that it required such secrecy? The following Thursday, I was determined to find out the truth. I strategically positioned myself in my garden, pretending to be tending to the plants, but really trying to hear more of their conversation. And that's when I overheard a conversation that finally began to shed light on the whole situation. They were in the backyard, and the wind carried a few full sentences to me. I heard her say, "Dad, I understand that you were afraid to tell Linda about me, but it's past time. I want to be a real part of your life." And his answer left me even more intrigued. "Emma, you know this is a complicated situation. When I married Linda, I thought I would never have contact with you again. Your mother had made it very clear that she didn't want me involved in your life." Emma! I finally found out her name, and it also became clear that she was indeed his daughter, from a relationship before his marriage to Linda. But why was it kept a secret? I kept listening, and Michael continued explaining. "When your mother died and you came to me, I was desperate. I didn't know how to explain to Linda that I had a daughter she didn't know about. I thought it would be easier to keep it a secret until I found the right way to tell her." Now it was starting to make sense. Emma was Michael's daughter from a previous relationship, and her mother had prevented contact between father and daughter. When her mother died, Emma sought out her father, but he was already married to Linda and didn't know how to explain the situation. But even then, I still didn't understand why this was so complicated. Why not just tell Linda the truth? Any woman would understand that a husband has a right to have a relationship with his own daughter. It was then that I heard the part of the conversation that finally explained the full complexity of the situation. Emma said, "Dad, I know Linda always wanted children, and that you tried for years without success. I understand why you're afraid to tell her you already had a daughter." Now it all made sense. Linda couldn't have children, and discovering that her husband already had a daughter from a previous relationship would be emotionally devastating. Michael was trying to protect his wife's feelings, but at the same time, he wanted to maintain contact with his daughter. It was an impossible situation, where any decision he made would cause pain to someone he loved. If he told Linda the truth, she would be devastated to discover he had the daughter she'd always dreamed of having. If he continued to keep it a secret, he would be unfair to Emma, who had a right to have her father present in her life. Girls, in that moment I felt terrible for having misjudged the situation. I had spent months imagining a sordid betrayal, when in reality it was a story of family love, of a father trying to reconnect with his daughter without hurting his wife. All those affectionate gestures I'd interpreted as romantic were simply the love of a father getting to know his adult daughter after years of forced separation. The hugs, the hair stroking, the forehead kisses, all of it was paternal affection, not passionate love. And the emotion I saw between them was the emotion of a father-daughter relationship being rebuilt after years of loss. Emma's tears weren't those of a desperate lover. They were those of a daughter who had finally found her father and was terrified of losing him again. But the full revelation of this story was yet to come, and when I discovered all the details, I realized the situation was even more touching and complex than I had imagined. Soon you will know the whole truth, and I guarantee you will be moved by this family story. Girls, now that I knew Emma was Michael's daughter, not his lover, I began to see the whole situation differently. But there were still many unanswered questions, and what I discovered next deeply moved me. Over the next few days, I paid attention to every detail of the conversations I overheard, trying to better understand this family's story. And you have no idea how touching and complex this situation truly was. One afternoon, I overheard a longer conversation between Michael and Emma. They were in the backyard, and she was talking about her childhood, about growing up without her father. "Dad," she said, "Mommy always told me that you didn't want to know me, that you chose not to be a part of my life. I grew up believing that you had rejected me." Michael's voice was cracking as he replied, "Emma, your mom was upset with me when we broke up. I was too young, too immature, and I made mistakes. When she got pregnant, I freaked out. I wasn't ready to be a father, but that doesn't mean I didn't want you." Girls, my heart sank listening to this conversation. It was a story of misunderstandings, of wounded pride, of two people who walked away and left a child in the middle of the conflict. Emma continued, "When Mommy was sick, in the last months of her life, she told me the truth. She said you had tried to stay in touch with me when I was little, but she wouldn't let you. She was sorry, Dad. In the last few days, she kept saying how unfair she had been to you and me." I could hear the tears in her voice, and I imagine Michael was moved too. It was a story of forgiveness, of second chances, of love that endured despite years of separation. "That's why I looked for you," she continued. "When Mom died, I had no one left, and she had given me her address, told me about her new life. She said I had a right to know my father." Now I understood why their reunions were always so emotional. They were getting to know each other for the first time as adults, building a father-daughter bond that had been denied them for so many years. And I also understood why Michael was so afraid to tell Linda. It wasn't just about her infertility. It was the fact that he had hidden such an important part of his life, a daughter who was now a young adult. The following week, I witnessed a scene that deeply moved me. Emma had arrived earlier than usual and was helping Michael tend to the garden. They were replanting the rose bushes Linda loved so much. As they worked together, I overheard them talking about simple, everyday things. She talked about her work, her friends, her dreams for the future, and he listened attentively, asking questions, showing genuine interest in his daughter's life. "You know, Dad," she said at one point, "I've always dreamed of a day like this. Working in the garden with you, talking about life. It's all I've ever wanted." And his response made me cry. "Emma, I miss so many important moments in your life. Your first steps, your first word, your first day of school. I can't get those moments back, but I can be there from now on." It was beautiful to see how they were building this relationship. There was affection, mutual respect, and a genuine desire to make up for lost time. But I knew this situation couldn't go on forever. Eventually, Linda would find out, or they would have to make the decision to tell the truth. And that's exactly what happened. One Thursday, I noticed their conversation was more tense than usual. Emma sounded determined, and Michael sounded worried. I could hear her say, "Dad, we can't put this off any longer. Either you tell Linda about me, or I will." She was right, of course. It wasn't fair to anyone to keep this secret. Linda had a right to know. Emma had a right to officially exist in her father's life, and Michael had a right to live without this constant guilt. "I know, Emma," he replied. "I should have told her a long time ago. It's just, I'm afraid of her reaction. I'm afraid of losing you both." "Dad," Emma said firmly, "if Linda really loves you, she'll understand. And if she doesn't, maybe you're not as compatible as you think. But hiding the truth isn't a solution to anything. Girls, this young lady is so wise, isn't she?" At 25, she was more mature than her own father. The following weekend, something happened that changed everything. Linda decided to return home early from a work trip and arrived home just as Emma was there. I was on my porch when I saw Linda arriving in a taxi. Emma was in the garden with Michael, and they didn't see the car coming. When Linda opened the gate and saw a young woman in the garden with her husband, her expression was one of complete surprise and confusion. "Michael," she called, and both he and Emma turned around in fright. The silence that followed was awkward. Michael turned pale, Emma blushed, and Linda stood in the middle of the garden, clearly not understanding what was happening. "Linda," Michael began, his voice trembling, "I need to explain something to you." But before he could continue, Linda looked closely at Emma, and I saw her expression change. It was as if she were studying the girl's face, searching for similarities. "You are," Linda started to say, but stopped mid-sentence. It was Emma who broke the silence. "I'm Emma. I'm Michael's daughter." Linda's reaction was different from what any of us expected. Instead of anger or shock, she simply said, "I knew it. That's right, girls." She knew. Michael and Emma were more surprised than I was. "What do you mean you knew?" Michael asked, visibly confused. Linda approached them, a sad smile on her face. "Michael, did you really think I wouldn't notice? A young woman who comes here every week, always when I'm not around. You have the same dimple in your chin, the same way you laugh, and most of all, you've changed. You've become happier, lighter. It was obvious something important was happening in your life." She turned to Emma. "And you must be the reason he was so happy. I was wondering if it was a different situation. But when I saw you two together just now, the way he looks at you, I knew immediately that you were family." Girls, I was watching this scene with tears in my eyes. Linda wasn't mad. She was relieved to finally understand what was happening. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. Not accusingly, just curiously. It was Michael who answered, his voice breaking. "Linda, I was afraid of how you would react. I know how much you want children, and I thought finding out I already had a daughter would be painful for you." Linda was silent for a few seconds, processing his words. Then she did something that completely surprised me. She walked over to Emma and hugged her. "Emma," she said, "I'm so sorry you had to grow up without your father, and I'm sorry we lost so much time getting to know each other. But from now on, if you want, I'd love to be a part of your life too." Girls, I was crying so much that I had to go inside to keep quiet. It was the most beautiful scene I had ever witnessed in my life. Emma hugged Linda back, and I could see she was crying too. "I'd love to," she said. "I've always dreamed of having a complete family." And that's when Michael joined in the hug, and the three of them stood there in the garden, hugging and crying with emotion. It was the happy ending this story deserved. Over the next few days, I watched the family dynamic completely change. Emma started visiting on weekends as well, not just for the secret meetings on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Linda welcomed her with open arms, and they began to develop a beautiful relationship. One afternoon, I saw them cooking together, laughing and chatting like mother and daughter. Linda was teaching Emma recipes, and they seemed genuinely happy in each other's company. Michael was radiant. He could finally openly express his love for his daughter without hiding anything from his wife. And Linda, instead of feeling rejected upon discovering her husband had a daughter, felt blessed to have a larger family. A week later, I saw them going shopping together, arm in arm like real mother and daughter. And the following weekend, they were planting new flowers in the garden, making memories together. Emma even formally introduced me to Linda one afternoon when I was in the garden. "Linda, this is Miss Ruth, our neighbor. Miss Ruth, this is my stepmother." Linda, stepmother. They had already defined their relationship, and Linda seemed proud of the title. "Emma told me you were always so nice to her when you saw her in the neighborhood," Linda said to me. "Thank you for always being so welcoming." I was almost mortified, girls. If only they knew that I spent months thinking it was a betrayal, that I almost told Linda that her husband was being unfaithful. But ultimately, this story taught me a very important lesson about not judging situations without knowing the whole truth. What seemed like a blatant betrayal was actually a beautiful story of family reconciliation. Today, when I see the three of them together in the garden, tending to the plants, laughing and talking, my heart fills with joy. Emma found the father she always wanted. Michael can finally be the father he always wanted to be, and Linda gained the daughter she always dreamed of having. It's an unconventional family, formed by choice and love, not just blood, but it's a true family, united by affection, respect, and second chances. And I, who thought I was the biggest gossip in the neighborhood, learned that sometimes the truth is much more beautiful than any gossip we can imagine. Girls, this was another story from our neighborhood, another lesson about not judging people before knowing the whole truth. I hope you enjoyed following this exciting journey as much as I did. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to be notified whenever I bring you a new gossip story or interesting situation that happens here in the neighborhood. Like the video if you enjoyed the story, and leave your thoughts on this twist in the comments. Did you expect this to be a family story instead of a betrayal? Leave your thoughts on this whole situation below. And don't forget to check out those natural products I pinned in the first comment. They're products that really work, and I use and recommend them. They're available for a variety of health issues: insomnia, joint pain, diabetes, diet products, and more. Just click the link to learn more. In addition to taking care of your health, you also help our channel continue to bring these incredible stories from the neighborhood. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this exciting story, and until the next gossip here on the channel. Bye, girls.